Okay, and welcome back everybody to another analysis of a game. This is from a tournament on redhotpawn.com. Per popular request, I am doing a game that I lost, and you will see how that happened, unfortunately. The tournament is still going on, so it's still possible that I could advance in the tournament. That's not clear yet, but this is one game that I was actually playing against the top-rated person at the time in the tournament. Now he's not the top-rated person anymore, but he was at the time. I actually split with him. Maybe a different time I'll analyze my victory against him. But this is the game that I played with the black pieces. He starts off d4. I played d5. Since I've switched almost exclusively to the King's Indian defense or some variation thereof, but at the time I was still playing, typical defenses d5. He plays c4, the Queen's Gambit, very standard opening, very common, very popular opening. I played e6, classic defense to the Queen's Gambit, Knight c3, Knight f6, all pretty standard so far. Bishop g5, he wants to pin the knight against the queen for the time being, so I played bishop e7 to break the pin. Nothing earth-shattering so far. He plays e3, knight bd7, knight f3, and I castled. And now he plays rook c1. Okay, now again, we're still pretty much in the opening. These are all book variations over here. But at this point, at some point or another, when you're playing the Queen's Gambit, or really any defense, you have to challenge for the center at some point. Now, he's got more space in the center. He's got this c-pawn way over here at c4. My c-pawn is still hanging back in its original position. My bishop is kind of tied down. His bishop is locked out of his, is locked out by this pawn over here on e3. But still, you can tell he's got a little bit more control, a little bit more space in the center. So I decided to challenge immediately on c5. Now, as you can see, as you'll see in a minute, this variation really loses me a pawn. I don't know if there's a way that I could save it, and I get a little bit of initiative in exchange for my pawn. And I know that what I did wasn't inherently a bad variation. You could still win the game, but I challenged it, and you can tell that even though I'm challenging in the C file, he's got a little bit more control. I'm kind of hemmed in a little bit more. My dark squared bishop, really needs to, is not quite pinned, but I certainly don't want the bishop to leave this diagonal, and then for the knight to be pinned. What this also does by playing c5 is it allows my queen another outlet. Otherwise, this knight doesn't really have anywhere to go other than to b6, which is not a great square for it at this point. So this allows my queen to get out. Obviously, he's planning on castling kingside eventually. By playing rook c5, again, he opens up. This file could open up soon, and he'll have a rook on it, and I can't get my rook on it because this bishop is hemmed in over here. So he plays c takes d5. I had to play e takes d5. I could have played knight take d5 instead. If I do that, though, I'm going to isolate the one. I don't want to end up with an isolated pawn, especially since he controls these files over here with his queen and his rook. He's got semi-open files over here. If I do that, then he can. I guess he'd have to play this in between move. Actually, he'd have to take my bishop over here because this bishop would then be being attacked twice. Then after he took it, then I'd have to, let's say, for example, if I took it with the queen, then he'd take the knight, and then I'd take back, and then he takes back, and I've got an isolated e-pawn. If I were to take back with the knight, then okay, then at least I don't have to isolate a pawn. Then well, let's see, this pawn. I guess, yeah, I guess the truth is I could have done that. That could have been an alternative, but I didn't do it. So let's see what actually happened in the game. And what actually happened is I took back with the e-pawn. Actually, now that I think about it, I probably could have taken with the knight, unless I'm overlooking some variation over here. That might have been a little bit better, but I didn't. I lost. Really, at this point, I lose a pawn by force. There's really not a whole lot I can do to save the pawn, because he plays d takes c5. Now, if I don't recapture, then I've lost a pawn anyway, and there really isn't any compensation that I have for it. So I play bishop takes c5. But now, of course, this knight is pinned against the queen because of the fact that this bishop left. So therefore, he can simply play knight takes d5, and I can't take back. So at this point, I'm down a pawn. Now, on the other hand, the advantage that I have is that his king hasn't castled yet, and I can perhaps put a little bit of pressure over there. This bishop is in a pretty good position, although this knight is kind of, this knight is protecting this knight. I wouldn't want this knight to, to be traded off and have to recapture with the pawn. So at least I do have a little bit of an initiative, but certainly I don't think I have full compensation for the pawn. So I play queen a5 check. Obviously what I want to try to do is, well, first of all, I want to unpin this knight. I want to be able to move this knight at some point, and as long as it's pinned against the queen, I can't move it. And of course, also what I want to do is I want to take advantage of the fact that his king is in the middle of the board, that his king hasn't castled yet. Once he castles and gets over there, then I have no compensation for the pawn, and I'll probably lose the game. So he comes back. He has to play knight c3. That's the only way to protect the king, well, to defend against the check, and of course at the same time to defend the a pawn. If I get the a pawn, then of course I'm right back even at least. So of course I continue to try to put the pressure on, and I play bishop b4. Threatening to, well, at this point I'm not really threatening anything directly because it's defended twice. But for example, if I could get my knight in here, if I could play, well, I can't play it right away because the queen is. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. I could play knight d4 and just load up on this knight, and this knight would be pinned. And obviously, you certainly don't want to unpin it by moving the king, and you certainly don't want to unpin it by moving the queen in front because then it's pinned against the queen. So clearly this is really my compensation for the pawn. I know it is an opening line, I believe, that that people have used, although the downside of course is that I am down a pawn. He plays bishop takes f6. Obviously I can't take the knight right away because now it's defended by the bishop. I have to retake, knight take f6. Now, what that actually helps me in that it frees up my light squared bishop, and it gets my knight to a better square than it was a moment ago. So to some extent that actually helps me. He probably does that. If you go back over here, I was looking at this game a little before, I was wondering why he took it, allowing me to free up the bishop and really get the knight into a better square. And I guess the reason is because this bishop really isn't doing very much. I mean, this bishop is really hemmed in by this pawn, and it would take really 2 or 3 moves to get this bishop into the action. So he plays bishop f6. Of course, knight takes f6. I don't want to destroy my pawn structure in front of the king side. He plays queen b3. He's trying to. He really needs to counterattack. He needs to try to get my bishop out of there. I play bishop e6. That threatens his queens. Now he's got to move his queen away. He plays bishop c4, well, to defend against that. You see, yeah, I guess this was probably, I don't really know of any other moves that I could have done, but what he needs to do over here is try to trade down. My responsibility, my goal, is to try to keep the pressure up and make him at least make some concessions or get a winning attack to compensate for the fact that I'm down a pawn. And not only am I down a pawn, he's got the rook on a good file. What he wants to do is he wants to castle out of there. Now I considered some other possibilities. I certainly considered the possibility of either knight d4, or knight d5 or knight e4. Either one of those, the purpose was, for our purposes, let's assume it would be e4. So obviously you want to take advantage of the fact that this knight is pinned and put extra pressure on it. But the thing is, that really doesn't help really in the immediate run, because he's still got 3 pieces defending it, and I've only got 3 pieces attacking it. So if he were, for example, later on to play a3, then that would be so quote-unquote putting the question to the bishop, and I'd have to either then trade it off or retreat, or he could just simply play bishop d3, and then I have to make my decision immediately. Either I have to take the knight and trade it off in exchange for him getting a messy pawn structure. For example, if I play knight takes c3, he plays b takes c3, and now he's got a little bit of a messy pawn structure over here. So I'd be down a pawn, but on the other hand, he'd have 2 isolated pawns over here. But instead, I played bishop e6, threatening the queen. I think I might have fallen into a little bit of a trap over here of playing what looks like a better move rather than what actually is. It looks like a good move because the queen is, almost trapped. But what this really allows him to do is, it almost allows him to escape, because it allows him to play bishop c4 and really do 2 things with one move. Number 1, threaten my bishop, and I certainly don't want to allow it to be captured. And then if I retake, then this pawn hangs, and I certainly don't want to do that, and it clears the way for his castle. Once he can castle, then my pressure is obviously pretty much alleviated, and now he's up by a pawn, and I'm just really playing for a draw, which is really what happened the rest of the game. I played bishop takes c4. I would have either had to do that or move the bishop. Maybe a move like bishop g4 was a possibility. He wouldn't want to trade off the knight because he wouldn't want to allow my bishop to take the knight. Then if he retakes with the g pawn, then I can move my queen over, prevent the castle. Maybe he can get a little bit, generate a little kingside pressure. But I played bishop takes c4, queen takes c4. Now I play rook a c8, trying to establish control of the open diagonal. Again, I still have some pressure on this knight over here. He hasn't had a chance to castle yet. And now I saw a chance to at least get a little bit of compensation. I somehow I felt that my pressure was going glimmering because